Hello and welcome to Coast AM's official YouTube channel. I'm your host, George Norrie. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And you can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and of course, on coasttocoastam.com. And about 1 million more square miles of ocean are covered in ice this year than in 2012. A whopping 60% increase. It's a dramatic deviation from the predictions of an ice-free Arctic in 2013. What's happening? Let's check in next with Robert Felix. He's the author of Not by Fire, But by Ice. We'll be back with Robert in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. I'm George Norrie. Robert Felix, a regular here on Coast to Coast, became interested in the Ice Age cycle back in 1991. He spent the next 8.5 years researching and writing about what he says is a coming ice age, and he's reacting with us this hour about this incredible story that has shown that this year the ocean is covered in more ice than last year, a 60% increase, and people are trying to figure out how can this happen. Let's bring Robert in. Hey, Robert, welcome back. How are you?
Hi, George. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Okay, 60% increase in ice when it's supposed to be almost gone. What's going on?
Yeah, 6 years ago, the BBC was reporting that the Arctic would be ice-free by the summer of 2013. So here we are, but instead there's almost 1 million more square miles of the Arctic Ocean covered with ice than at the same time last year. Like you said, yeah, it's a 60% increase. And we're not hearing much about that, but right now there's an unbroken ice sheet that's more than half the size of Europe that's stretching from Canada to Russia. So there's something going on, of course. And then, of course, Antarctica, too. It's not just in the Arctic. The Antarctic ice sheet, the Antarctic sea ice, is now the greatest on record. But we're not hearing about it. It just bothers me a lot that we're not hearing about it.
You really have. If we would not report on stories like this, Robert, most people would think, regardless of how and why, but most people would think all the ice shelves were melting away like crazy, wouldn't they?
They would absolutely, because that's what we're hearing about. But the Antarctic sea ice extent at the end of July was the highest on record. Talking about more than 18 million square kilometers, whereas in 2010 it was 17 something. So again, yes, we're being told it's global warming, but well, as you know, I keep insisting that we're headed into an ice age, and I think we're headed there faster than anybody realizes.
Well, we definitely can't be in some kind of warming spell, not if we've got 60% more ice out there, right?
No, we can't. And the thing is that there's stuff going on around the world right now that again, the mainstream media is not covering. I'm glad you are. But in southern Peru, and I'm talking about recent stuff, by the way, this record of return of the Arctic ice, that's from September 8th. That's only 2 days ago. The expanding Antarctic ice sheet breaking all records, that's from September 3. That's only a week ago. But how about September 2? More than 25,000 animals were killed in southern Peru due to snowfall in the northern highlands of Peru. In Bolivia, more than 70,000 animals, and this is dated August 31st. We're not talking years ago. More than 70,000 animals killed in Bolivia. That's 40,000 head of sheep and 30,000 cattle. In Brazil, 113 cities, the record snow. It just goes on and on and on. In Peru, this one is huge. You would think would have been all over. In Peru, more than 250,000 alpacas died of the cold and snow.
Huh.
And this is going to destroy the livelihood of so many people in Peru that it's unreal, and we're not hearing about it.
Now, what's the reason for this, Robert, in your opinion? What's going on?
Well, I think that we're looking for carbon taxes, and we're looking for ways to, our government and politicians looking for ways to tax us and tax us. just before I came on, you were talking about the recall election in Colorado, where people had better start listening. Well, Australians have just voted to end their carbon tax. And I'm hoping that the United States politicians will start taking note that the people who are trying, that the politicians who are trying to put this unnecessary carbon tax on us are being thrown out of office. And I hope the United States citizens start doing the same thing.
Now let's look at what is happening around the planet then. Let's assume things are getting colder. The ice in the oceans, that's indicative of that all by itself. Is this something to do with the sun? Is it an Earth cycle? What the heck's going on?
Well, yes, it has to do with the sun right now, but it's also a cycle. And that's what I write about in Not by Fire, but by Ice, is there is a cycle to ice ages that the climate modelers are not, well, I shouldn't say all of them. There's a lot more climate models that are beginning to take this into account, but ice ages come and go approximately every 11,500 years. It's a cycle that shows up in the geologic record for millions of years. And to think that just because we humans are on Earth and breathing, to think that we're going to change that cycle is nuts. I mean, there's all sorts of cycles. There's a smaller cycle about every 360 years. When we're looking at generally at little ice ages. There's another cycle about every 1,500 years when the Earth gets colder, drastically colder, and then you multiply that times 8, and there's a cycle about every 11,500 years, and then finally there's a big cycle about every 105,000 years when the Earth goes into a major, really major ice age. We are at the crux of all of those cycles right now, every single one of them. And they should be in everybody's climate models. And everybody, the climate models that we hear about are blaming CO2. CO2 has nothing to do with it. The cycles are going to come and go whether CO2 is high or whether CO2 is low.
Robert, let's talk about the ice age itself. Explain how it comes about, because a lot of people think it's cold 24/7. That's not the case. We still have our seasons, don't we?
Thank you. Yes, that is very true. Actually, it's cold enough right now to have an ice age, and that came from Morris Ewing. He was one time head of Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. He said that back in the 1970s. It's cold enough right now to have an ice age. All we need is more moisture, and we're getting it because precipitation has increased. But if you think about that, if you live in let's say Winnipeg, and it's January, it's definitely already cold enough to have an ice age. All you have to do is have more snow. And so if you get, let's say you get, a foot of snow a day, at the end of 30 days, you've already all of a sudden got 30 feet of snow. And
it adds up.
And it doesn't have to be any colder. It's not a cold age. It's an ice age. And what happens is that the oceans start giving up their moisture, and precipitation increases and increases, and the ice starts to accumulate on the continents. Now, I'm not talking about these huge glaciers that come grinding out of the north. It's more like a snow blitz, where it just snows more and more and more, and we've been seeing that in Europe the last few winters. By the way, meteorologist Joe Bastardi thinks that Europe is in for another brutal winter.
I think we're going to get hit with one. Yeah, I think North America is going to get hit with one. It's been unusual. It seems like when it's unusually warm in the summer and in the fall, it's incredibly cold in the winter. I don't know why, but it seems that way to me.
Well, it's probably a small cycle there too. But the other part, of course, is the little ice age is during the little ice age is that temperatures and the climate went extreme. There were areas of the world that had the highest temperatures in like 300 years. And then later on, same year, same location, they had the biggest snowstorms in 500 years. That's how it happens.
I don't remember. Go ahead, Robert.
Well, I'd love to tell you, talking about the little ice age, and I've got a video on my website that I think a lot of people would find fascinating. It's a video. It's only 7 minutes long. It is from Dr. Sally Baliunas. She discusses the little ice age and the history of people's superstitious reactions to extreme weather. Dr. Baliunas is staff astrophysicist at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, so she's got some credentials there. But she talks about during that last little ice age, that during the harshest period, it brought about crop failure, it brought about starvation, brought about disease, death, and social unrest. But here's the other thing it brought about is the witch trials. Because at that time, people were so superstitious, they knew that if they got Satan's help, that they could cook the weather. And so that extreme weather of the little ice age and those harsh conditions, that contributed.
Are you still with us? Oh, we're going to have to call you right back. We've lost Robert, so we'll get him right back. And ironically, we only have a few seconds, so we've got the break to do that, and we'll probably take some phone calls with you. Perhaps Robert is experiencing ice on his phone line, and it has crackled away, and it has taken him down. Anyways, our guest, Robert Felix, his website, go to it, take a look at that video he just mentioned. It's iceagenow.com, which is linked up for you at coasttocoastam.com as well. His book, I started interviewing Robert back in my early St. Louis days. Not by fire, but by ice. I was fascinated by it. You should see the cover on his book. Absolutely riveting. It's a city. It looks like Chicago. It's a graphic look of a city buried in ice, which is like a mile or two high. I mean, it's just truly unbelievable. Anyway, we'll be back with more with Robert Felix in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. Robert Felix with us, of course. iceagenow.info is his website, which is linked up for you at coasttocoastam.com. Robert, let's talk about for a moment again all this ice that seems to be coming back. The climatologists who 6 years ago predicted that we'd be ice-free by the summer of this year, are they reacting to this? I mean, what would they be saying right now?
Well, it's kind of hard for them to say it right now. There's beginning to be a scientific consensus that it is getting cooler, and I have to say I haven't heard anything from Al Gore lately. I understand that he was saying that in 2009 was that the Arctic would be ice free by 2013. I haven't been able to find that. It was apparently in a talk he gave. So, if any of your listeners know when he said that, or have a link to that, boy, I would love it. But no, you had asked earlier about the sun. Does that have anything to do with it? And, absolutely. Right now, today, there's no sunspots, none. Yesterday, there were no sunspots. And there are many scientists. One of the big ones I think of is Dr. Habibullo Abdusamatov from Russia. He's head of the Russian part of the International Space Station. So he's an astrophysicist who knows what he's talking about. He says that we're headed into a little ice age. I've talked and met with Piers Corbin. He's an astrophysicist in London who says that because of the sunspot cycle, we're headed into a little ice age. Because during the little ice age, the little ice age lasted about 500 years, but the most severe part of that was from about 1550 to 1700. And in part of that, there was about 80 years when there were no sunspots, and the Earth got colder. I mean,
It sure did.
There were brutal winters. The ice started expanding out of the Alps. The crops failed, and millions of people died of starvation. Millions. And I think that we should be preparing for that, because that was a time of no sunspots. Well, right now, sunspots activity is the lowest it's been in more than 100 years. And many scientists, when they look at what's going on, they say that that's where we're headed right now, is another Maunder minimum, perhaps only a Dalton minimum, another time when there were very few sunspots. So that's happening right now. And I wish that people would be listening to this. I'm really talking about, saving food, stockpiling food. I don't sell any food on my website. This doesn't do me any good. But I really think people better be ready to take care of themselves.
Some people, Robert, are going to die during one of these situations. Yes. Case in point, if you're an elderly person and you're locked up away in your home and it's in the brutal winter and we get an ice storm or this mini ice age, starts to kick in, the power goes out, or maybe you can't open the door because there's 5 feet of snow out there, or what happens when your roof collapses?
That's the big one.
Yeah, exactly.
5 feet of snow, and there's places in Peru. I think it was just this month is that some of the areas did have. No, it's in Bolivia. I'm finding it right now. Bolivia, snowfall more than 5 feet deep, causing serious problems. Well, how do you walk through 5 feet of snow? It's up to most people's chin.
Well, you
practically.
You can't drive. You can't do anything.
And nobody can come rescue you. The trains can't get through. The cars can't get through. The planes can't land. You better be prepared to be. You're going to be on your own. And I just see that coming. I just worry more and more about it. I don't know how long we've been talking. I know that you did interview me back when you were in St. Louis, so that was.
Yep.
12, 15 years ago.
Well, that was back in 1997. We started.
Okay, well, I've been talking about this for, that I was saying in 1997 that we would be admitting within 20 years that we're in an ice age. And I think we're getting close. Yeah, that 2017 is coming closer, but I still think that I haven't had to change my story. Let's put it that way.
No, you haven't. And you haven't had to defend yourself, because every issue like this ice story we just had tonight backs up what you say. Right.
And the other thing, one of the big things that you hear about, and probably most of the listeners have been hearing, is that the sea levels are going to rise, and they're going to swamp New York City. They're going to swamp Boston. They're going to swamp all of these places. But, in 2010 and in 2011, sea levels went down, and that is from satellite measurements, and I have that on the website. I give you where the satellite measurements can be found, so I back all of this up. And that is where the moisture comes from to build up the huge ice sheets. Because during the last ice age, Canada was covered by more than 2 miles deep of ice, and sea levels were almost 400 feet lower than they are now. I think you've had people on who've talked about seeing the underwater civilizations off the coast of Japan and other underwater civilizations, or evidence of that. I absolutely think they're right, because sea levels were that much lower, and I think we're going to see that start to happen again.
All right, let's take some calls for you. Gordon's in Phoenix, Arizona, where I don't think you have to worry too much about snow. Hello, Gordon. Go ahead.
Probably not.
Hey, hi, guys.
Hi, Gordon.
A quick question, a two-part question, actually.
Sure.
What is the time frame? How long would it take for this ice age to come along? Are we talking about a decade or a century?
Okay. The first half of that question is easy, is that it used to be that scientists thought, when I first started studying this, scientists thought it took like 5,000 years for an ice age to begin. But in the late 1980s, they began drilling cores into the ice in Greenland, and they found out that every ice age in the last 250,000 years began from periods of warmth similar to today, went into full-blown glacial severity in less than 20 years.
Yeah, pretty darn fast.
Very, very fast, Gordon.
And what's your other question, Gordon?
Second part is, what does it do to climate of Arizona? I live in the desert. Do I wake up one morning and go to kick the rattlesnake off my porch and go face to face with a polar bear? Or
No.
Good question. What does he do?
In Phoenix, my studies have shown that in the American Southwest, temperatures during the last ice age were very similar to today. The main thing is that they had more moisture. So you would probably be seeing more rain and more moisture than you're seeing now, and you'd probably start to see it green up a little bit. But no, temperatures, that's a thing that I want to be clear about, and I'm glad you asked that, because I do have a map on the website that shows generally how far south the ice advanced. For instance, Seattle was covered with 4,000 feet of ice, and yet the ice only extended as far south as Olympia, Washington, and 150 miles south of there, temperatures were only about 5 degrees colder than they are right now. So you should be fine that way in Phoenix.
I think, Robert, a lot of people confuse efforts to fight pollution with global warming and climate change, and they're really two different issues. Nobody, Robert Felix, George Norrie, nobody wants pollution.
No, I hate pollution. And I used to live in, Gordon, you say you're from Phoenix. I used to live in Tucson, and I used to see the very hazy skies on some of the summer days. It was polluted. Let's face it. And I don't like that any better than anybody else does. But when they start talking about CO2 causing global warming, to me that's a straight lie. I just don't. It doesn't correlate. There have been times in the past when CO2 was 5 times as high as it is now, and it wasn't any warmer. There's no correlation.
Let's go to our international line in Toronto, Canada. Christian is with us. Hey, Christian, thanks for calling.
Hello, Mr. Norrie. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
You too.
My question for you, sir, Mr. Felix.
Yes.
You had mentioned the 60% increase in the Arctic ice shield. I'm just wondering, over the course of the last 5 years, the decrease, is it exponential? So the new 60% is more than we've ever had, or are we just slowly creeping up to what we had, say, 5 years ago? I'll take my answer off the air. Thank you.
Okay, this is pretty dramatic, though, isn't it, Robert?
It is dramatic. Yes, it's not a record based on the last 5 years. But if we would see ice increase by 60% every year, then certainly then it's going to be beating that. So what it does, though, is that with all of this talk about no ice going to be there, is it's just proving that their models are totally inadequate, proving that their models are totally wrong. Another thing that I've mentioned with you before, George, is that I think during the last ice age, even though Canada and Toronto, I guess, was covered, but even though much of Canada was covered with 2 miles of ice, the Arctic Ocean had about the same amount of ice back then as it has now. And scientists have been kind of scratching their head as how could that be? Well, I think it's because of the underwater volcanoes in the Arctic Ocean. There's the Gackel Ridge, which is 1,100 miles long. It's an underwater chain of volcanoes that is mightier than the Alps, and scientists used to think that was inactive, but a few years ago, the Max Planck Society sent down the submersibles to find out how inactive it was, and it was so active that they had to watch out it was melting some of their cables. So I think that's why the Arctic remained comparatively ice-free during the last ice age, and I think it probably is affecting it right now.
And when they talk about the 60% increase, Robert, are there some regions of the planet that are melting away and others are gaining ice, like this Arctic area?
Oh, yes, there are some areas, some definitely, some glaciers have been melting, absolutely. But others, we're losing track, though, is they check out a few glaciers that are melting and start screaming about it. But Antarctica, which now has record ice, and when Christian from Toronto, but in Antarctica, that is the record, as far as I can tell, for all time, for at least since they've been keeping records. Well, Antarctica contains more than 90% of all of the world's ice, which means that 90% of the world's glaciers are growing, and we're only hearing about the 10% that are melting. And to me, we're looking at the wrong thing. And now with the Arctic ice sheets growing in the Himalayas, they were saying that all the ice in the Himalayas was going to be gone by 2015, and now it turns that a lot of the glaciers in the Himalayas are growing again. So it's a part of the cycle, but I just think that we're getting the wrong story.
Let's go to Gloria in Wisconsin, east of the Rockies. Hello, Gloria. Good morning.
Oh, and thank you for taking my call. I want to know.
Whoop. On whose phone is that?
I think we're back now. That was me.
That was you. Okay, let's go back to Gloria then. Go ahead, Gloria.
Hello. I wanted to ask him a question, and then I want to make a very short statement.
Go for it.
Go for it.
Well, the question was, does he think the ice is going to cover the whole United States?
No, absolutely not. However, if I were in Wisconsin, do you have any of those eskers around you?
No. I would just trust Christ. I would trust the Lord. There's nothing I would do but trust Christ.
Okay.
Well, let's hope so.
During the last ice age, the ice I had mentioned, it came down as far south as Seattle. Then it went on a line over to north of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and then it essentially followed the Missouri River. So on the north side of the Missouri River, the ice cliffs were about 15 stories high, but on the south side of the Missouri River, you could have lived there. So it would depend. I'd have to look at my map. I've got maps on the website that show where the ice extended to during the last ice age, but there were parts of Wisconsin that were covered with ice. There were parts of Wisconsin that were not covered.
Anything prophetic about an ice age tied into the apocalypse or anything like that, Robert?
Not for me. One of the things that I did see during the about 11,500 years ago, when we had a comparatively short ice age, and when I say short, it lasted like 1,500 years, and it killed 40% of all of the larger mammals on Earth. But that also occurred. That was the time when that ended. That was the time of what is called Noah's flood. There were, and I'm not saying that I'm religious, but that was the time there were huge floods around the world. That's when the Columbia River flooded. I went through the Wallula Gap. The waters did about 800 feet deep. That's the time when huge floods went down the Connecticut River about 150 feet deep. So in that respect, yeah, it kind of ties in with that. And it ties in, as you know, we haven't mentioned it tonight, but I think it ties in with magnetic reversals.
Explain.
Well, magnetic reversal, the Gothenburg magnetic reversal occurred about 11,500 years ago.
All
and
right.
that's when we had the ice age that killed the mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers and the mastodons and the giant ground sloths, so many. 23,000 years ago, we had another magnetic reversal, and we went into a drastic ice age. So ice ages do seem to correlate with magnetic reversals.
Let's go next to Kevin in Austin, Texas. Squeeze you in here real fast, Kev. Go ahead.
Hi, I was just wondering, do you guys think that the government might be using global warming as a way to use taxpayers' money to either launder for something else? You know, there's a lot of theories that go around out there that global warming is a hoax, and there's people that have come out on certain programs and documentaries. Their names escape me. You know, they claim to know and actually have pictures with Al Gore and talk about how global warming is actually a fraud to launder money. So I was wondering what your guys' opinion on that was.
Well, it may be, Kevin, a fraud to make money, that's for sure. Robert, go ahead real fast.
Well, I don't know. I've heard that Al Gore has made $100 million since he left the vice presidency, so he's doing very well. I don't know if I call it a fraud. I certainly call it a con job, and I call it a global warming con job on my website all the time.
You sure do. Robert, give us some information about your website, of course, and Not by Fire but by Ice. Can you still get that? It's been around for a while.
You can still get Not by Fire but by Ice. It's available on my website. It's also available on Amazon. My website is iceagenow.info. And, I started with you, George. It took me 6 years to get my first 60,000 hits. And now I just checked it out the other day. I'm getting 14,000 hits a day. So I haven't caught up with you yet, but you're helping.
Well, hey, you deserve it, my friend. Keep the good news coming for us. And we shall be back in a moment as we talk about lucid dreams right here on Coast to Coast AM.
To Coast AM on our official YouTube channel. I'm your host, George Norrie, and don't forget to visit the Coast Insider membership area on coasttocoastam.com, where you can access our past, upcoming, and classic shows.